Sometimes the words that break us are the same ones that heal us. Sometimes the people we look down on carry the very wisdom our hearts have been searching for. In 1892 Abilene, wealthy widow Clara Belle Whitmore thought she knew everything about a person just by looking at them. When she saw Samuel Pike, a weathered cowboy with dusty boots and calloused hands, she decided to put him in his place. "If you're so smart, then speak Latin," she mocked in front of the whole saloon. But when Samuel opened his mouth and spoke those ancient words, everything changed. The Latin prayer he recited wasn't just beautiful, it was the exact same blessing her long-lost son had whispered years ago. How could this simple cowboy know words that only her boy had known? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust never settled in Abilene. It hung in the air like a permanent reminder that this was a town built on movement, cattle drives, railroad cars, and the restless energy of men who lived by the seasons and the whims of the market. In the summer of 1892, the Kansas heat pressed down on the wooden sidewalks and tin roofs with an intensity that made even the hardiest cowboys seek shade by mid-afternoon. Clara Belle Whitmore had never sought shade in her life. At 57, she stood as straight-backed as the day she'd arrived in Abilene 15 years earlier, a young widow with more money than sense and a determination to prove that breeding and education could flourish, even in cattle country. Her three-story Victorian house on Elm Street rose above the dusty streets like a declaration of war against the rough-hewn simplicity that defined the rest of the town. Painted pristine white with emerald green shutters, it stood as a monument to what she believed civilized people could accomplish when they refused to lower their standards. The silver locket at her throat caught the morning light as she stepped onto her wraparound porch, checking the hanging baskets of petunias that her housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, tended with religious devotion. Inside that locket lay the only photograph she possessed of her son, Thomas, taken when he was 19. Just before he'd left home, with promises to write every week and return for Christmas. That was 8 years ago. The letters had stopped coming after 6 months, and Clara had built her walls higher with each passing season. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore," called out Margaret Sullivan, the banker's wife, as she passed by with her market basket. "Lovely day for the ladies' auxiliary meeting." Clara nodded with the practiced grace that had served her well in these social circles. "Indeed, Margaret. I trust you've prepared your report on the new schoolhouse fund." "Of course, though I must say some of the board members are questioning whether we need such an ambitious curriculum. After all, most of these children will end up working with cattle or in the shops." The comment stung in a way Clara couldn't quite name. She touched the locket unconsciously, thinking of Thomas and his voracious appetite for learning. He devoured every book in their library before he was 16, teaching himself Latin from her late husband's old texts and memorizing poetry with the dedication of a scholar. Where that hunger for knowledge had taken him remained a mystery that haunted her quiet hours. "A proper education never goes to waste, Margaret," Clara replied, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been contradicted without consequence. "Even cowboys should know how to read more than cattle brands." 3 blocks away, Samuel Pike was learning the hard way that not all cowboys fit Clara's narrow definition. He stood in the meager shade behind Hendricks's general store, his worn Bible open to the book of Matthew, teaching young Jimmy Chen to sound out the words that would help the boy communicate with customers who didn't speak Chinese. "In the beginning," Jimmy repeated carefully, his finger following the text with determined precision. "That's from John, not Matthew, but you're reading it perfectly," Samuel said, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone who'd spent years coaxing knowledge from reluctant minds. "Your English is getting stronger every week." Samuel Pike looked every inch the part of what Clara Whitmore would dismiss as common. His clothes were clean but patched, his boots worn thin from years of honest work, and his face bore the deep lines that came from squinting into prairie winds and cattle dust. At 43, he moved with the careful economy of a man whose body had absorbed more punishment than it cared to remember. But when he opened that leather-bound Bible, his father's Bible, filled with handwritten Latin notes in the margins, something transformed in his demeanor. His shoulders straightened, his voice took on a different cadence, and the careful education that had once shaped a younger version of himself emerged like sunlight through clouds. "Mr. Pike," Jimmy asked, still struggling with the pronunciation of his teacher's name, "why do you know so many words?" Samuel closed the Bible gently, running his thumb along the worn leather cover. "My father believed that words were tools, Jimmy. The more tools you have, the better you can build your life." What Samuel didn't tell the boy was that his father had been a professor of classics at a small college in Missouri before the war changed everything. That Samuel himself had once sat in lecture halls and debated philosophy with young men who'd never seen a cow outside of picture books. That the Latin phrases filling the margins of this Bible had been their way of staying connected across the bloody battlefields of a conflict that had stolen more than just lives. It had stolen futures and identities and the luxury living as the men they'd been raised to be. Now Samuel worked for whoever would hire him, mostly mucking stalls and mending fences for ranchers who saw his quiet dignity as a sign of good work ethic rather than evidence of a different kind of past. He preferred it that way. The weight of expectations that came with education and social standing had proved too heavy to carry after Shiloh and Antietam had shown him what civilized men could do to each other when they believed their cause was righteous. Enough. The afternoon heat was building toward its daily crescendo when Clara Belle Whitmore made her way down Texas Street toward Murphy's Saloon. It wasn't a destination that would normally appear on her social calendar, but the Ladies' Auxiliary was discussing the town's growing problem with public drunkenness, and Clara believed in gathering first-hand intelligence before forming her opinions. Murphy's Saloon occupied the corner of Texas and Cedar, its swinging doors and painted sign advertising cold beer and fair dealing to anyone who could read. The establishment catered to cowboys, railroad workers, and the occasional traveling salesman who didn't mind the smell of tobacco and honest sweat. Clara had never set foot inside, but she'd heard enough complaints from the church ladies to know it was where the town's rougher element gathered to spend their wages and voice their opinions on everything from cattle prices to presidential politics. The sound of laughter and conversation spilled onto the wooden sidewalk as Clara approached, her practical boots clicking with authority on the worn planks. Through the dusty windows, she could see men clustered around tables, their hats pushed back as they gestured with beer mugs and made their points with the animated enthusiasm of people who rarely had audiences for their thoughts. Samuel Pike sat at a corner table, nursing a beer that had grown warm while he listened to the complaints of Ben Marcus, a fellow ranch hand who'd been cheated out of 2 weeks' wages by a rancher who'd suddenly discovered irregularities in the cattle count. 37 head missing, he says. Ben was explaining to the small group that had gathered around their table. 37 head that was there when we moved them to the north pasture, but somehow vanished before we reached the holding pens. Convenient mathematics, observed Jake Morrison, another cowboy whose weathered face spoke of decades in the saddle. Happens whenever McCreary's running short on cash. Samuel listened without comment, his attention focused on the injustice rather than the audience. He'd seen enough corruption in uniform to recognize it in civilian clothes, but he'd also learned that sometimes the best response was patient observation rather than immediate action. Truth had a way of emerging if you gave it time and space. "What do you think, Pike?" Ben asked, turning to Samuel with the respect that came from knowing a man's character rather than his circumstances. "You've worked for McCreary longer than any of us." Samuel took a careful sip of his beer, considering his words. "I think a man's word should mean something, whether he's signing a contract or counting cattle. And I think when it doesn't, it says more about his character than his circumstances." The simple observation carried weight in the gathered silence, the kind of weight that comes from being spoken by someone who chooses his words carefully rather than simply filling space with noise. It was at that moment that Clara Belle Whitmore decided to make her entrance. The saloon fell quiet as she stepped through the swinging doors, her emerald silk dress and perfectly arranged hair as out of place among the work clothes and weathered faces as a peacock in a chicken coop. Every head turned, every conversation paused, and every man in the room suddenly became conscious of his posture and language. "Gentlemen," Clara announced, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "I trust I'm not interrupting anything important." The silence stretched uncomfortably until Murphy himself, an Irish immigrant whose saloon served as the town's unofficial community centre, stepped forward with nervous politeness. "Mrs. Whitmore, ma'am, this is unexpected. Is there something I can help you with?" Clara surveyed the room with the calculating gaze of a general assessing a battlefield. Her eyes moved from table to table, taking in the faces of men she'd seen around town but never truly noticed, until her attention settled on Samuel Pike's corner table. "I'm conducting research for the Ladies' Auxiliary," she explained, her tone suggesting that this was both a reasonable explanation and a sufficient justification for her presence. "We're concerned about the influence of public drinking establishments on the town's moral character." A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the room, but most of the men simply stared, unsure how to respond to this unexpected invasion of their sanctuary. Samuel Pike watched the scene unfold with the quiet attention he brought to most human dramas. He recognized Clara Whitmore by reputation, the wealthy widow who held court over Abilene's social hierarchy, with the iron determination of someone who'd never been told she couldn't have exactly what she wanted. But he also saw something else in her careful composure, something that reminded him of officers he'd known who'd built their authority on the foundation of deep, unacknowledged fear. "Ma'am," he said quietly, rising from his chair with the automatic courtesy that had been drilled into him by his father and reinforced by years of military discipline. "Perhaps you'd like to sit down. It's been a long, hot day." Clara's attention snapped to him with laser intensity, taking in his worn but clean clothes, his respectful posture, and the careful way he'd phrased his offer as a suggestion rather than a presumption. "How thoughtful," she replied, her voice carrying just enough edge to make it clear that she found his courtesy suspicious rather than welcome. "And you are?" "Samuel Pike, ma'am. I work for the McCreary Ranch." Clara's eyes narrowed as she processed this information, filing it alongside her assumptions about cowboys and their place in the social order she'd constructed for herself. "Mr. Pike," she said, testing the name as if it might reveal hidden depths or dangerous shallows. "Tell me, what do you and your companions discuss when you gather in establishments like this? What great matters of philosophy and politics occupy your time?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Samuel felt the familiar weight of being judged by appearances rather than substance. Around the room, other men shifted uncomfortably, sensing that they were witnessing more than a simple social inquiry. "We discuss the things that matter to working men, ma'am," Samuel replied carefully. "Fair wages, honest dealing, and the hope that tomorrow might offer better opportunities than today." Clara smiled, a cold, precise expression that held no warmth. How remarkably practical. And do these discussions ever venture into more elevated territory? Literature, perhaps? Philosophy? The classical languages that form the foundation of true education. The trap was set and baited, and everyone in the room could see it. Clara Belle Whitmore had decided to make an example of this weathered cowboy, to demonstrate the vast gulf between her world and theirs, between education and ignorance, between civilization and the rough pragmatism of frontier life. Samuel felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with being misunderstood by choice rather than circumstance. He could have mentioned the dog-eared volumes of Shakespeare and Cicero hidden in his saddlebags, could have quoted the Latin verses his father had taught him alongside the Bible passages that had sustained them both through the darkest chapters of their lives. But experience had taught him that revelation rarely changed minds that were determined to remain closed. "I reckon most of us know what we need to know to do our jobs and treat people fairly," he said quietly. Clara's smile widened, sensing victory. How refreshingly humble. "But surely a man of your obvious intelligence has encountered the foundational languages of Western civilization? Latin, perhaps. After all, if you're truly as clever as you appear, such knowledge should come naturally." The saloon had fallen completely silent now, every man recognizing the cruelty in Clara's challenge. They might not understand the specifics of what she was demanding, but they understood humiliation when they saw it being served up with surgical precision. "If you're so smart, then speak Latin," Clara proclaimed, her voice ringing with the satisfaction of someone who believed she was about to prove a point that needed proving. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to stop the town's clocks. Samuel Pike stood perfectly still, his weathered hands relaxed at his sides, his eyes meeting Clara's with the quiet dignity of someone who'd been underestimated so many times that surprise had worn thin. Then, in a voice that carried the reverent cadence of prayer, he spoke, "Benedict Domine, nos et haec tua dona quae de tua largitate sumus sumpturi, per Christum Dominum nostrum. Amen." The Latin words fell into the silence like stones into still water, each syllable clear and perfectly pronounced, carrying the weight of ancient tradition and personal devotion. Samuel's voice never wavered, never hesitated, and when the prayer concluded, he met Clara's startled gaze with the calm dignity of someone who had nothing left to prove. "It's a blessing for a dying mother," he said softly, his voice carrying across the stunned silence. "My father taught it to me when I was 12 years old. He said every son should know how to ask God's mercy for the woman who gave him life." Clara Bell Whitmore felt the words hit her like a physical blow. The silver locket at her throat suddenly felt impossibly heavy, and somewhere in the depths of her carefully constructed composure, something cracked. Those weren't just any Latin words. They were the exact blessing her son Thomas had whispered to her during her bout with pneumonia 7 years ago, the same prayer he'd learned somewhere in his travels and brought home like a gift. The saloon remained frozen in that moment, every man witnessing Clara Whitmore's transformation from predator to prey, though none of them understood the deeper significance of what had just transpired. Clara opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, her usual command of language having deserted her entirely. She felt exposed and foolish, standing in her silk dress among these working men who had just witnessed her cruelty turned back on itself by the quiet grace of a man she'd tried to humiliate. Without another word, she turned and walked out of Murphy's saloon, her heels clicking on the wooden floor with less authority than they'd carried on her entrance. Behind her, the silence gradually gave way to whispered conversations and the sound of men processing what they'd just witnessed. Samuel Pike sat back down at his table and picked up his warm beer, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what had just occurred. Around him, his companions looked at him with new eyes, suddenly aware that their quiet friend carried depths they'd never suspected. "Where did you learn that?" Ben Marcus asked quietly. Samuel took a sip of his beer and gazed out the dusty window toward the street where Clara Whitmore had disappeared. "From a man who believed words could build bridges," he said simply, even when the people holding either end couldn't see across the distance between them. Clara Bell Whitmore had not slept properly in 3 days. Each time she closed her eyes, Samuel Pike's voice echoed in her mind, speaking those Latin words with a reverence that had stripped away every assumption she'd built about the difference between education and wisdom. The blessing for a dying mother, the same blessing Thomas had whispered to her, haunted her waking hours and invaded her dreams with relentless persistence. On the 4th morning after the saloon incident, she found herself standing in front of the locked door to Thomas's room, her hand trembling as she turned the brass key she hadn't touched in over a year. The hinges protested with a soft whine as the door swung open, releasing the faint scent of lavender sachets and the deeper, more complex aroma of memories too painful to face. Thomas's room remained exactly as he'd left it 8 years ago, his books arranged on the shelves with mathematical precision, his writing desk still bearing the slight ink stain from an overturned bottle during one of his late-night study sessions. At his bed, made with the military corners he'd learned from watching his stepfather's old cavalry habits. Clara had forbidden Mrs. Rodriguez from cleaning here, unable to bear the thought of disturbing even the dust that had settled in her son's absence. She moved through the room like a ghost visiting her own past, her fingers trailing along surfaces that held the impressions of a young man's dreams and ambitions. The bookshelf drew her attention first. Leather-bound volumes of Cicero and Virgil stood alongside modern novels and treatises on agriculture and animal husbandry. Thomas had possessed an eclectic mind, as comfortable with ancient philosophy as he was with practical applications of knowledge. It was behind his copy of Ovid's Metamorphoses that Clara found the bundle of letters, tied with a blue ribbon and tucked away as if Thomas had meant to keep them private. Her hands shook as she untied the ribbon, recognizing her son's careful handwriting on the envelope marked, "For Mother, if something happens to me." The first letter was dated 6 months after Thomas had left home, written in his characteristic style, enthusiastic, thoughtful, and filled with observations about the world beyond Abilene's borders. "Dearest Mother," it began, "I hope this finds you well and that Mrs. Rodriguez is keeping the petunias properly watered. I know you worry about my wandering, but I want you to understand that every mile I travel teaches me something new about both the world and myself. Today I met a man who has changed my understanding of what it means to be educated." Clara's breath caught as she read the next paragraph. "His name is Samuel Pike, and he works as a cowboy on a ranch outside of Dodge City." "Mother, I know what you're thinking. What could a common ranch hand possibly teach a young man who's read Cicero and can conjugate Latin verbs? But Mr. Pike is not what he appears to be. When I was taken ill with fever, he cared for me with the gentleness of a trained physician and the wisdom of a scholar. He speaks Latin as fluently as you or I, and his knowledge of classical literature rivals any professor I might have met in a university setting." The letter continued, but Clara's vision blurred as the implications crashed over her like a wave. Samuel Pike, the man she'd tried to humiliate, the cowboy she'd dismissed as uneducated, had been her son's teacher, protector, and friend during his travels. The very man whose dignity she'd attempted to destroy had cared for Thomas when she couldn't. She forced herself to continue reading. "Mr. Pike never speaks of his past, but I suspect he has known educated society and chosen to leave it behind. There's a sadness in his eyes when he thinks no one is watching, the kind of sadness that comes from seeing too much of what civilization can do to decent people. He taught me the Latin blessing for mothers that his own father had passed down to him, and when I asked why he thought such knowledge was important, he said, 'A man should always know how to pray for the people who shaped his heart.'" Clara's hands trembled as she reached the letter's conclusion. "I write this now because Mr. Pike has taught me something you always tried to instill, but I never truly understood that a person's worth has nothing to do with their circumstances and everything to do with their character. If something should happen to me on these travels, Mother, I want you to know that I've learned to see the world through kinder eyes. And if you ever meet Samuel Pike, I hope you'll see him as I do, not as a simple cowboy, but as one of the finest men I've ever known." The letter was signed with Thomas's characteristic flourish, but below his signature he'd added a postscript that stopped Clara's heart. "P.S. Mr. Pike doesn't know I'm writing this, but he's taught me more about being a gentleman than all my formal education combined. He treats every person with respect, regardless of their station, and he never makes anyone feel small or ignorant. I hope someday I can be half the man he is." Clara sank into Thomas's desk chair, the letter clutched against her chest as the full magnitude of her cruelty began to settle in her conscience. She had spent 3 days believing herself the victim of an embarrassing encounter, when in reality she had attempted to humiliate the very man who had shown her son kindness and wisdom during his final months of life. The second letter, dated 2 weeks later, contained even more devastating revelations. Mr. Pike stayed with me through the worst of my illness, Mother. When the fever broke, he told me stories about ancient Rome and recited poetry in 3 languages to keep my spirits up. He never made me feel like a burden, even when I was too weak to help with the ranch work. Yesterday, when I was feeling stronger, he taught me how to read the stars, using methods the Romans had used 2,000 years ago. Knowledge, he said, is only valuable if it connects us to something larger than ourselves. Clara's vision blurred again as she read Thomas's description of his final conversation with Samuel. I asked him why he chose to work as a cowboy when he clearly possessed the education to pursue more prestigious occupations. He was quiet for a long time before answering. Some men are meant to build their lives in drawing rooms and lecture halls, he said. Others find their peace under open skies with honest work and simple friendships. The war taught me which kind of man I am. I didn't press him for details, but I could see in his face that he'd paid a price for his education, a price that had led him to choose simplicity over sophistication. The third letter was shorter, written in a shakier hand. The doctor says I may not recover from this latest fever, Mother. If that proves true, I want you to know that I've made peace with whatever comes next. Mr. Pike has been with me every day, reading scripture and classical poetry, helping me understand that death is simply another transition, like the seasons changing or the sun setting to make room for stars. He taught me the blessing for dying mothers today, the one in Latin that he learned from his father. Benedic Domine nocet haec tua dona. He said, "Bless, O Lord, us and these thy gifts." He told me it was a prayer that acknowledged both gratitude and sorrow, appropriate for times when we must let go of precious things. I found myself thinking of you, Mother, and hoping that someday you might meet this remarkable man who has shown me such kindness. Clara's composure finally shattered as she read the final lines. If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home for Christmas as promised. Please don't mourn too long, Mother. I've lived more fully in these months of travel than in all my previous years combined, largely because Samuel Pike taught me to see wonder in ordinary things and dignity in ordinary people. I hope you can find the same peace he helped me discover. The letter fell from Clara's nerveless fingers as 8 years of suppressed grief crashed over her with unstoppable force. She had spent nearly a decade wondering about her son's final months, imagining him alone and afraid, when in reality he had been cared for by a man of extraordinary compassion and wisdom, a man she had treated with contempt and cruelty just 3 days ago. The irony cut deeper than any knife. She had prided herself on education and breeding, on the ability to recognize quality and character, yet she had completely misjudged the most important encounter of her recent years. Samuel Pike, the humble cowboy she'd tried to humiliate, had been the closest thing to a father her son had known during his final journey. While she'd been maintaining her social position and protecting her reputation in Abilene, Samuel had been teaching Thomas to face death with courage and grace. Clara wept then deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place she'd kept locked away since the day she'd accepted that Thomas would never return home. She wept for her son's death, for the years of misplaced pride, for the kindness she'd repaid with cruelty, and for the walls she'd built that had prevented her from recognizing wisdom when it stood directly in front of her. When the tears finally subsided, Clara Belle Whitmore sat in her son's chair and faced a truth that would reshape the remainder of her life. Everything she'd believed about education, breeding, and social worthiness had been proven wrong by a weathered cowboy who'd shown her dying son more grace than she'd shown any living person in years. The question that remained was what she intended to do about it. Outside Thomas's window, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Abilene's dusty streets, and somewhere in that maze of ordinary lives, Samuel Pike continued his quiet work, unaware that the woman who'd tried to break his dignity was sitting in her dead son's room, holding letters that revealed him to be the finest man she'd never bothered to recognize. For 5 days, after discovering Thomas's letters, Clara Bell Whitmore found herself conducting what could only be described as reconnaissance. She would position herself at strategic locations around town, the mercantile store's front window, the church steps during evening prayer, the shaded bench outside the post office, and watch for glimpses of Samuel Pike going about his daily routine. What she observed challenged every remaining assumption she'd held about the man her son had described with such reverence. Each afternoon around 3 o'clock, Samuel would arrive behind Hendrix's general store, carrying a small slate board and a worn canvas bag. Within minutes, children would emerge from the shadows. Jimmy Chen, with his careful English, Maria Santos, struggling with her letters, young Billy Cooper, whose father believed education was a waste of time for future ranch hands. Clara watched from the mercantile window as Samuel knelt in the dust, using his slate board to teach Maria how to write her own name. His patience was extraordinary, never showing frustration when the little girl formed her letters backward, never rushing when she needed to sound out each syllable multiple times. When Maria finally wrote Maria correctly, her face lit up with such pure joy that Clara felt an unexpected tightness in her throat. "That's it, exactly," Samuel told the child, his voice carrying across the afternoon air. "Now you can sign your name to anything important, letters, documents, even books if you write any someday." "I could write books?" Maria asked, her eyes wide with possibility. "Why not? You've got everything you need right here." Samuel tapped gently at her temple. "And here," he placed his hand over her heart. "The rest is just practice." Clara found herself remembering Thomas at that age, hungry for stories and knowledge, asking endless questions about everything from Latin grammar to the migration patterns of birds. Samuel Pike was giving these children the same gift her son had possessed, the belief that learning was not a burden, but a doorway to broader horizons. The teaching sessions typically lasted 2 hours, with Samuel moving between his students like a conductor, orchestrating a symphony of young minds. He carried no formal curriculum, no standardized texts, but his canvas bag yielded treasures that captured each child's imagination. For Jimmy Chen, he produced a small Chinese-English dictionary that helped bridge the gap between languages. For Billy Cooper, he'd brought basic arithmetic lessons disguised as cattle-counting games. For Maria, he offered simple readers that told stories of brave girls who changed their communities through persistence and courage. On the 6th day of her observations, Clara finally gathered the courage to approach. She waited until the children had dispersed to their respective homes, then walked around the corner of Hendrix's store with her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Samuel was cleaning his slateboard with a damp cloth, his movements methodical and unhurried. When he noticed Clara approaching, he straightened but didn't retreat, a response that spoke of dignity rather than defensiveness. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly, touching the brim of his hat with automatic courtesy. Clara had rehearsed this moment dozens of times, crafting elaborate apologies and explanations that would somehow convey the magnitude of her regret without revealing the depth of her ignorance. But standing face to face with the man who'd shown her dying son such kindness, all her prepared words deserted her. "Mr. Pike," she began, her voice smaller than she'd intended. "I wanted to, that is, I need to." She stopped, frustrated by her inability to find language adequate to the moment. Samuel waited patiently, his grey eyes holding neither judgment nor expectation. It occurred to Clara that this was probably how he looked at his young students when they struggled with difficult concepts, alert and encouraging without being condescending. "I was wrong," she said finally, the words emerging with stark simplicity. What I did at Murphy's was cruel and unfair, and I owe you an apology." Samuel studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether her words carried genuine regret or social obligation. "Apology accepted, Mom," he said quietly. "We all make mistakes when we're trying to protect something we value." The grace of his response, his assumption that her cruelty had stemmed from protective instinct rather than simple malice, nearly undid Clara's carefully maintained composure. Here was the man Thomas had described, someone who chose to see the best in people even when they'd shown him their worst. "I see you're teaching the children," Clara said, grasping for safer conversational ground. It's very generous of your time." Samuel glanced at the slate board in his hands, then back at Clara. "They're good kids, smart and eager to learn. They just need someone to believe in them." "Where did you learn to teach?" The question emerged before Clara could stop herself, driven by genuine curiosity rather than social maneuvering. A shadow crossed Samuel's face, the kind of expression Clara was beginning to recognize as his response to questions about his past. "Here and there," he said carefully, "a man picks up skills as he goes through life." Clara sensed the conversation approaching boundaries Samuel wasn't ready to cross, but she also felt the weight of Thomas's letters urging her toward greater understanding. "The children clearly trust you," she observed. "That's not something that develops overnight." "Trust has to be earned," Samuel replied. "Children are honest about who deserves their respect and who doesn't. They don't care about your clothes or your house or your reputation. They care about whether you see them as people worth investing in." The observation carried an implicit critique of Clara's own values, but Samuel's tone held no accusation. He was simply stating a truth that had emerged from his experience, the same way he might comment on weather patterns or cattle behavior. "I noticed you're using quite sophisticated materials," Clara said, nodding toward his canvas bag. "That Chinese-English dictionary, for instance. Those aren't common items in a place like Abilene." Samuel's smile held a hint of mystery. "You'd be surprised what you can find if you know where to look and what to ask for. Most people are generous when they understand you're trying to help children learn." It was then that Clara realized she was witnessing something remarkable. A man who had somehow created an informal school for the children others had written off as uneducable. He was doing it without official sanction, without payment, without recognition, simply because he believed education was a right rather than a privilege. "Mr. Pike," Clara said, making a decision that would have surprised her a week earlier, "I wonder if I might be of assistance with your teaching efforts." Samuel's eyebrows rose slightly, the first sign of genuine surprise he'd shown during their conversation. "That's a generous offer, Mrs. Whitmore. But I'm not sure." "I have resources," Clara interrupted, then caught herself being presumptuous. "What I mean is, if there are books or materials that would help the children, I might be able to provide them. I have a substantial library, and I could certainly purchase additional supplies if needed." Samuel studied her carefully, as if trying to determine whether this offer came from genuine desire to help or from some more complex social calculation. "That's very kind," he said slowly. "But these children, their families might not be comfortable accepting charity from someone like me," Clara finished, understanding the delicate dynamics at play. Her social position, which she'd always considered an asset, suddenly felt like a barrier between herself and meaningful contribution. "It's not about worth," Samuel said gently. "It's about pride. These families work hard for what they have. They want to feel like they're earning opportunities for their children, not receiving handouts." Clara nodded, beginning to understand the complexity of the relationships Samuel had built with his students and their families. "Then perhaps we could find a way to structure assistance that honors that pride," she suggested. "Some kind of arrangement where the families feel they're contributing rather than simply receiving." For the first time since their conversation began, Samuel's expression warmed with what might have been genuine interest. "What did you have in mind?" Clara realized she was venturing into territory she'd never explored, the practical application of privilege for purposes beyond social advancement. "I'm not sure yet," she admitted, "but I'd like to learn more about what you're doing here. Would you be willing to show me?" Samuel glanced at his slateboard, then at Clara's silk dress and carefully arranged hair. "It's dusty work," he warned, "and the children might be shy around someone they perceive as important. Then perhaps I should dress more practically," Clara said, surprising herself with the suggestion. "And as for importance, well, I think I'm learning that I may have had wrong ideas about what makes a person important." Samuel Pike studied Clara Bell Whitmore for a long moment, taking in her earnest expression and the subtle shift in her posture that suggested genuine humility rather than social performance. Finally, he nodded. "Tomorrow afternoon, if you're serious about this, 3 o'clock behind the general store. Wear clothes you don't mind getting dirty." Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the nervous excitement of embarking on unfamiliar territory with no guarantee of success. "I'll be here," she promised. As she walked home through Abilene's dusty streets, Clara found herself thinking about the slateboard Samuel carried and the careful way he'd cleaned it after each lesson. Such a simple tool, but in his hands it became an instrument of transformation, offering children possibilities they might never have imagined for themselves. That evening, she stood in Thomas's room again, but this time the grief felt different, less like an ending and more like a beginning she was finally ready to embrace. Clara Bell Whitmore had owned 37 dresses in her adult life, but not one of them seemed appropriate for sitting in the dust behind Hendrix's general store. She stood before her mahogany wardrobe the next morning, pulling out and discarding options that were either too fine for outdoor teaching or too formal for gaining children's trust. Finally, she settled on a simple brown cotton dress she'd worn for gardening, practical, washable, and modest enough not to intimidate young students. Mrs. Rodriguez watched this transformation with barely concealed amazement. In 15 years of service, she'd never seen Clara choose clothing based on function over appearance. "Señora," the housekeeper ventured carefully, "perhaps the blue silk would be more appropriate for receiving visitors?" "I'm not receiving visitors today, Rosa," Clara replied, checking her reflection in the mirror. "I'm going to school." At precisely 3 o'clock, Clara appeared behind the general store, wearing her brown dress and practical boots, her hair pulled back in a simple bun that wouldn't distract from the lessons ahead. Samuel Pike was already there, arranging his materials with the systematic care of someone who understood that preparation was half of teaching. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his surprise at her punctuality evident only in the slight widening of his eyes. "The children should arrive shortly." Clara nodded, suddenly nervous about this venture into unfamiliar territory. "What should I do? I don't want to interfere with your established routine." "Just observe today," Samuel suggested. "Let them get used to your presence. Children can sense when adults are genuine, and they need time to make that assessment." As if summoned by his words, the students began to appear. Jimmy Chen arrived first, his English dictionary clutched under his arm like a precious treasure. Maria Santos followed, carrying a slate tablet that had seen better days but was obviously cherished. Billy Cooper came last, glancing nervously at Clara, before settling into his usual spot near Samuel's right side. "Good afternoon, everyone," Samuel said, his voice carrying the warm authority that had won these children's respect. "We have a visitor today. Mrs. Whitmore is interested in learning about our lessons." 3 pairs of young eyes turned to Clara, with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. She felt acutely aware of how different she must appear from the adults these children usually encountered, cleaner, softer, carrying the indefinable markers of a life lived without physical hardship. "Hello," Clara said simply, resisting the urge to fill the silence with unnecessary words. Jimmy Chen, always the most diplomatic of the group, offered a small bow. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Whitmore. Today, we're going to work on letter writing," Samuel announced, pulling several sheets of precious paper from his canvas bag. "Jimmy, you've been wanting to write to your grandmother in San Francisco." Maria, you mentioned wanting to thank Mrs. Patterson for the fabric scraps. Billy, your mother's birthday is next week. Clara watched in fascination as Samuel guided each child through the process of composing personal letters. He didn't provide templates or force them to copy standardized phrases. Instead, he helped them find their own words for their own thoughts, offering spelling assistance and gentle suggestions about structure while preserving each child's unique voice. "Dear grandmother," Jimmy began, his careful English improving with each sentence, "I am learning to read American books now. The stories are different from the ones you told me, but they make me think of home in new ways." Clara felt her throat tighten as she recognized the profound gift Samuel was giving these children, not just literacy, but the confidence to believe their thoughts were worth sharing with the world. It was during Maria's letter-writing session that Clara made an unexpected discovery. The little girl was struggling with a particular passage, trying to explain to Mrs. Patterson how the fabric scraps would become a dress for her cornhusk doll. Samuel encouraged her to keep trying, but Clara could see frustration building in the child's face. "May I?" Clara asked quietly, moving closer to Maria's slate. Samuel nodded, and Clara knelt beside the little girl. "What are you trying to say about the doll dress? That it will be beautiful," Maria said, her voice small with disappointment. "But I don't know the right words." Clara thought for a moment, then said, "What makes something beautiful to you?" Maria's face brightened. "When it has colors like flowers, when it feels soft, when it makes me happy to look at it." "Those are perfect words," Clara said gently. "Write exactly that. It will have colors like flowers and feel soft, and it will make me happy to look at it." As Maria carefully copied the phrase, Clara caught Samuel watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. When the child finished writing, she looked up at Clara with a smile that could have lit the entire territory. "That's much better than what I was thinking," Maria said. "Thank you." The afternoon progressed with Clara, gradually finding ways to contribute without overshadowing Samuel's leadership. She helped Billy sound out difficult words, shared stories that illustrated the grammar concepts Samuel was teaching, and listened with genuine interest as each child read their completed letters aloud. But it was after the lessons ended, when the children had dispersed to their homes, that Clara made her most significant discovery. As Samuel packed his materials, she noticed a small, leather-bound journal at the bottom of his canvas bag, and protruding from its pages was a familiar piece of blue ribbon. "Mr. Pike," she said carefully, her heart beginning to race, "that journal, may I ask where you acquired it?" Samuel's hands stilled on the canvas bag, and for a moment Clara thought he might refuse to answer. Then, slowly, he withdrew the journal and held it with the reverence reserved for sacred objects. "It belonged to a young man I knew," he said quietly. "Thomas Whitmore. He gave it to me before he died, asked me to keep it as a reminder of our conversations." Clara felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Her son's journal, the one she'd searched for among his belongings without success, had been in Samuel's possession all these years. The blue ribbon she'd seen was the same one Thomas had used to mark his place in books since childhood. "He wrote about our lessons together," Samuel continued, seemingly unaware of Clara's inner turmoil. "About the Latin prayers, the classical literature we discussed, the way education could be a bridge between different worlds. He was a remarkable young man, intelligent, compassionate, eager to understand rather than judge." Clara's vision blurred as she processed this revelation. Not only had Samuel cared for her dying son, but Thomas had trusted him enough to share his most private thoughts. The journal likely contained insights into her son's final months that she'd never imagined existed. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Samuel's voice carried concern. "Are you feeling well?" Clara realized she'd been staring at the journal without speaking, her emotions too complex for immediate expression. "I'm sorry," she managed. "It's just hearing about Thomas affects me deeply. He was my son." The words hung in the afternoon air like a confession that changed everything. Samuel's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, understanding, and finally, a deep, painful recognition of what Clara's presence in his life might mean. "Your son," he repeated slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Clara said, tears threatening despite her efforts at composure. "And from what I've learned recently, you showed him more kindness in his final months than I ever knew he needed." Samuel closed the journal carefully, his movements deliberate and reverent. "Thomas spoke of you often," he said quietly. "He loved you deeply, Mrs. Whitmore. Whatever differences you might have had, never doubt that." The simple statement broke through Clara's remaining defenses. Standing in the dust behind a general store, surrounded by the echoes of children's laughter and the tools of humble education, she finally understood why her son had chosen to travel rather than remain in her carefully constructed world. He'd been searching for the kind of authentic human connection that Samuel Pike offered so naturally, the ability to see worth in every person, regardless of their circumstances. "Mr. Pike," Clara said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to request, "would you be willing to share some of those memories with me? I know I have no right to ask, after how I treated you, but—" "You have every right," Samuel interrupted gently. "You're his mother, and perhaps it's time those memories found their way home." As they walked together through Abilene's dusty streets, Clara Bell Whitmore began to understand that her son's true education hadn't ended when he left her house. It had begun when he met a man who understood that wisdom and worth had nothing to do with social position and everything to do with the content of one's character. 3 weeks had passed since Clara discovered Thomas's journal in Samuel's possession, and their afternoon teaching sessions had settled into a rhythm that surprised them both with its naturalness. Clara arrived each day in her practical brown dress, carrying a basket of supplies she'd carefully selected to supplement Samuel's materials without overwhelming his carefully established relationships with the children's families. It was during a lesson on basic arithmetic that Clara made another discovery that would reshape her understanding of her son's final journey. Billy Cooper was struggling with multiplication tables, his frustration mounting as the numbers seemed to dance beyond his comprehension. Samuel had been working patiently with the boy for 20 minutes when Clara noticed him reach into his shirt pocket and withdraw a small wooden object. "Here, Billy," Samuel said gently, placing the carved piece in the boy's hands. "This might help you see the numbers differently." Clara's breath caught as she recognized the craftsmanship. The wooden cross was no larger than a man's thumb, but every surface had been carved with meticulous care. Tiny symbols adorned its edges, mathematical equations, Latin phrases, and small decorative flourishes that spoke of hours spent in patient creation. "What is it?" Billy asked, turning the cross over in his small hands. "It's a thinking piece," Samuel explained. "Sometimes when our minds get tangled up, holding something smooth and familiar can help us find our way back to clarity. Try working your multiplication while you hold it." Clara watched in amazement as Billy's tension seemed to dissolve. His fingers traced the carved symbols while his mind tackled the numerical problems, and within minutes he was solving equations that had frustrated him moments before. "It works!" Billy exclaimed, his face bright with success. "The numbers make sense when I hold it." Samuel smiled, but Clara could see something deeper in his expression, a mixture of pride and sorrow that spoke of profound memories attached to this simple object. When the lesson ended and Billy reluctantly returned the cross, Clara found herself studying Samuel's face with new intensity. "That's beautiful craftsmanship," she observed as they packed up the teaching materials. Samuel's fingers closed around the wooden cross with protective instinctiveness. "Thank you," he said quietly. "May I ask, did you carve it yourself?" Samuel hesitated, his thumb running over the smooth surface of the cross. "I made it for someone special," he said finally. "Someone who needed something to hold on to during difficult times." Clara felt her heart begin to race, though she couldn't yet name the suspicion taking shape in her mind. "Someone you cared about?" "Very much," Samuel replied, his voice carrying the weight of memory. He was like a son to me, in many ways." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She had been thinking of the cross as simply another example of Samuel's kindness, but now she began to understand its true significance. This wasn't just any carved object, this was something Samuel had made specifically for Thomas, a tangible expression of love and care during her son's illness. "Mr. Pike," Clara said carefully, her voice barely steady, "the person you made that for, was it Thomas?" Samuel's eyes met hers, and in that moment, Clara saw confirmation of what she'd suspected. He nodded slowly, his expression revealing the depth of grief he still carried for her son. "He was having terrible nightmares during the fever," Samuel explained quietly, "calling out for his mother, for home, for things he'd lost or left behind. I thought if he had something solid to hold, something blessed, it might give him peace." Clara's vision blurred as she imagined her son, fevered and afraid, finding comfort in this simple wooden cross that a cowboy had carved, with infinite patience and love. "Did it help?" "It did," Samuel said, his voice growing softer. "He carried it with him every day after he recovered, said it reminded him that someone cared enough to spend hours making something just for him." Samuel paused, struggling with emotion. "He said it was the first gift anyone had given him that wasn't meant to improve or educate him, but simply to comfort him." The observation cut Clara to her core. She realized that in her determination to provide Thomas with every advantage, every opportunity for advancement, she had somehow forgotten to offer him the simple comfort of knowing he was loved exactly as he was. "He treasured it," Samuel continued. "Even when he was too weak to hold anything else, he kept that cross pressed against his palm. Near the end, he asked me to promise that it would go to someone who needed the same kind of comfort he'd found in it." Clara understood now why Samuel carried the cross, why he used it to help struggling children like Billy Cooper. Thomas had transformed a personal gift into a legacy of compassion, asking Samuel to share its comfort with others who needed something to hold on to during difficult moments. "That's why you use it in your teaching," Clara said, not really asking a question. "Thomas believed that comfort and learning went hand in hand," Samuel replied. "He said fear made it impossible to absorb new ideas, but when people felt safe and cared for, their minds opened like flowers in sunlight." Clara felt tears threatening as she recognized her son's philosophy in Samuel's words. Thomas had understood something about education that she, despite all her emphasis on academic achievement, had missed entirely. Learning wasn't just about accumulating knowledge, it was about creating space for minds and hearts to grow without fear of judgment or failure. "Mr. Pike," Clara said, making a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. "I wonder if you would consider expanding what we're doing here." Samuel looked puzzled. "In what way?" "The children we're teaching, they're wonderful, but there are others in town who could benefit from the same approach. Adults who never learned to read, young people whose families couldn't afford schooling, even some of the more privileged children who might benefit from learning alongside peers from different backgrounds." Samuel's expression grew thoughtful, but Clara could see caution in his eyes. "That's an ambitious idea, Mrs. Whitmore, but it would require resources we don't have, and it might attract attention we're not prepared to handle." Clara had been expecting this objection, and she'd spent considerable time thinking about how to address it. What if we could find a way to create something official, not charity, but a genuine school that served the entire community? "The school board would never approve funding for that kind of program," Samuel said practically. "They barely support the basic curriculum we have now." "What if the funding came from private sources?" Clara asked. "What if someone who had the resources was willing to invest in education without expecting control over the curriculum or methods?" Samuel studied her carefully, understanding beginning to dawn in his expression. "You're talking about using your own money. I'm talking about using my resources the way Thomas would have wanted them used," Clara corrected, "to create opportunities for learning based on comfort and respect rather than fear and competition." The idea had been forming in Clara's mind for days, sparked by watching Samuel's gentle effectiveness with the children and her growing understanding of what her son had valued during his travels. She possessed the financial means to create something meaningful, but she lacked the wisdom and experience that Samuel brought to teaching. It would be a partnership, she continued. Your knowledge of how to reach people who've been overlooked by traditional education, combined with resources that could give those methods proper support and scope. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his fingers still wrapped around the wooden cross that represented so much of what they were discussing. What about the social complications? He asked finally. Abilene isn't ready for a school that brings together children from all backgrounds, taught by methods that don't match what people expect from education. Clara had considered this challenge extensively. Then perhaps it's time for Abilene to discover what Thomas learned during his travels, that real education happens when people are valued for their potential rather than their circumstances. Samuel Pike looked at Clara Bell Whitmore with new eyes, seeing not the sharp-tongued social arbiter who had tried to humiliate him weeks earlier, but a woman transformed by grief into someone willing to honor her son's memory through meaningful action. It would be difficult, he warned. People resist change, especially when it challenges their assumptions about social order. Thomas didn't let difficulty stop him from pursuing what he believed was right, Clara replied. I think it's time I learned to follow his example. As they walked home through Abilene's dusty streets, Clara carried with her the image of her son holding Samuel's carved cross, finding comfort in the knowledge that someone had cared enough to create something beautiful just for him. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of creating that same sense of care and comfort for an entire community, a legacy worthy of the young man who had taught her, through his absence, what truly mattered in life. Clara had been searching through Thomas's belongings for the better part of an hour when she found it a pressed wildflower, delicate as parchment, tucked between the pages of his copy of Wordsworth's poetry. The flower was so fragile that breathing on it might have reduced it to dust, but it had been preserved with such care that its original lavender color still showed faintly through the translucent petals. Beneath the flower, in Thomas's careful handwriting, was a note dated just 2 months before his death. From Mr. Pike's lesson on finding beauty in unexpected places, he said, Mother would understand this better than anyone, that she had taught him to see wonder in simple things, though perhaps he had forgotten to mention it. Prairie wildflower, species unknown, found growing in impossible soil during impossible drought. Like hope, he said, like the human spirit when it refuses to surrender to circumstance. Clara pressed the note against her chest, overwhelmed by the complexity of emotions it evoked. Thomas had been thinking of her during his lessons with Samuel, crediting her with teaching him to appreciate beauty, even as he'd been learning to see it through Samuel's more practical wisdom. The realization that her son had carried thoughts of her into his relationship with Samuel transformed her understanding of both men's significance in her life. The discovery came at a crucial moment. Word of Clara's educational partnership with Samuel had begun to circulate through Abilene's social circles, generating reactions that ranged from polite bewilderment to barely concealed scandalization. Just that morning, Margaret Sullivan had cornered Clara outside the post office with concerns that could no longer be dismissed as mere gossip. "Clara, dear," Margaret had said, her voice carrying the tone of someone delivering unfortunate but necessary news, "people are beginning to talk about your association with that Pike fellow." "Are they?" Clara had replied, her tone deliberately neutral. How fascinating that adults would concern themselves with children's education. "It's not the education that concerns them," Margaret had pressed on, clearly uncomfortable but determined to fulfill what she saw as her social duty. "It's the appearance of impropriety. A woman of your standing, spending so much time alone with a man of his background." Clara had felt her old defensive instincts stirring, the familiar urge to protect her reputation through sharp words and social positioning. But then she'd thought of Samuel's patient teaching, of the wooden cross he'd carved for Thomas, of the way the children's faces lit up when they mastered new concepts under his gentle guidance. "Margaret," Clara had said quietly, "I think you may be confusing appearance with substance. Mr. Pike has shown more genuine character in our brief acquaintance than some people demonstrate in a lifetime of proper social positioning. Margaret's shocked expression had followed Clara all the way home, but it was the discovery of the pressed flower that truly clarified what she needed to do next. That afternoon, she arrived at the teaching session, carrying a small wooden box that had belonged to her grandmother. Inside, carefully cushioned with silk cloth, lay the pressed wildflower and Thomas's note. "Mr. Pike," she said as they finished the day's lessons, "I found something I think you should see." Samuel examined the fragile flower with the reverence he brought to all things connected to Thomas. As he read the note, Clara watched his expression shift through surprise, recognition, and finally, a deep sadness that spoke of memories both precious and painful. "He talked about that lesson for weeks," Samuel said softly. "We'd been discussing how people survive in harsh circumstances, and we came across this little flower growing in a crack between two rocks. No soil to speak of, no reliable water source, but there it was, not just surviving, but blooming." "What did you tell him about it?" Clara asked. Samuel was quiet for a moment, his fingers hovering near the flower without quite touching it. "I told him that beauty had a way of appearing where people least expected it, and that the most extraordinary things often grew in the most ordinary circumstances. I said his mother had probably learned that lesson long before either of us, watching him grow into the remarkable young man he'd become." Clara felt her throat tighten at the recognition that Samuel had been speaking of her with respect and admiration even before they'd met. "You talked about me?" "Often," Samuel admitted. "Thomas worried that you thought poorly of his choices, that you saw his traveling as evidence of failure rather than growth. I tried to help him understand that mothers love their children, even when they don't understand their choices." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Reverend Matthews, the town's Methodist minister, whose expression suggested he was on a mission that involved more than casual social calling. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, with the carefully controlled politeness that preceded difficult conversations, "I wonder if I might have a word." Clara glanced at Samuel, who began gathering his teaching materials with the practiced efficiency of someone who recognized when discretion was the better part of valor. "Of course, Reverend," Clara replied. "Mr. Pike was just leaving." But Samuel paused in his packing, something in the minister's tone apparently striking him as worth attention. "Mrs. Whitmore," Reverend Matthews began, "I've been hearing some concerning reports about your recent activities. While I admire your charitable impulses, some members of our congregation are worried about the example being set by your close association with certain individuals." Clara felt her patience wearing thin. "Which individuals would those be, Reverend?" "I think you know," Matthews replied, glancing meaningfully at Samuel. "A woman of your social position, spending unsupervised time with men of questionable background, well, it raises questions about judgment and propriety." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire, and Clara felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of what she was willing to tolerate in the name of social harmony. "Reverend Matthews," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority she'd learned from watching Samuel handle difficult situations, "I'm curious about your definition of questionable background. Are you referring to Mr. Pike's dedication to educating children who would otherwise go without, his patience with students whom others have dismissed as unteachable, his knowledge of classical literature and ancient languages that would shame most university graduates?" Matthews looked taken aback by the directness of her challenge. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm sure Mr. Pike is a decent enough fellow, but surely you can see how the appearance of these frequent meetings—" "The appearance," Clara interrupted, "is that a man of extraordinary character is donating his time and knowledge to help children learn, while I'm privileged to assist in that endeavor. If that troubles people's sense of propriety, perhaps they need to examine what they value more: genuine virtue or social performance." Samuel had stopped packing entirely now, his attention focused on Clara's defense of their partnership with an expression of surprised gratitude. "Mrs. Whitmore," the Reverend tried again, "I'm simply suggesting that there might be more appropriate ways to pursue charitable works. The Ladies' Auxiliary has several committees that could—" "The Ladies' Auxiliary," Clara said firmly, "has spent more time discussing the moral implications of my friendships than the educational needs of this community's children. I find that priority troubling." Reverend Matthews's face flushed with the embarrassment of someone whose authority had been questioned publicly. "I see," he said stiffly. "Well, I've delivered the message I was asked to convey. I hope you'll consider the wisdom of those who have your best interests at heart." After the minister left, Clara and Samuel found themselves standing in uncomfortable silence, the weight of what had just transpired settling between them like dust after a windstorm. "Mrs. Whitmore," Samuel said quietly, "I never intended for my presence in your life to create social difficulties. If you'd prefer to step back from our teaching partnership—" "Mr. Pike," Clara interrupted, her voice steady with newfound resolve. "Do you remember what you told Thomas about that wildflower, about beauty appearing where people least expected it?" Samuel nodded, uncertain where she was leading. "I'm beginning to understand what he meant," Clara continued. "The most extraordinary friendships sometimes grow in the most unlikely circumstances. And I'm not willing to let other people's narrow vision prevent me from tending something that's brought more meaning to my life than all their proper social arrangements combined." Samuel Pike looked at Clara Bell Whitmore with an expression that held gratitude, respect, and something deeper that neither of them was quite ready to name. In choosing to defend their partnership publicly, Clara had crossed a line that would reshape how Abilene saw her, and more importantly, how she saw herself. The pressed wildflower lay between them in its careful nest of silk, a reminder that the most beautiful things often flourished in impossible conditions, sustained by nothing more than determination and the occasional kindness of passing strangers who recognized their worth. The accusation came on a Tuesday morning, delivered by Sheriff Morrison with the uncomfortable bearing of a man who disliked his current assignment but felt duty-bound to complete it. Clara was tending her petunias when she saw him approaching Samuel's modest boarding house on Cedar Street, his badge catching the early sunlight like a warning. By noon, half of Abilene knew that Samuel Pike had been accused of stealing $47 from Hendricks's general store. By evening, the other half had heard the story, along with various embellishments that painted Samuel as everything from a common thief to a confidence man who'd been working a long game against the town's more trusting citizens. Clara learned about the accusations from Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd heard the news at the market and rushed home with the breathless urgency of someone delivering information too important to wait for proper timing. "Signora," Rosa gasped, having run most of the way from town. "They say Mr. Pike stole money from the store. Sheriff Morrison took him to the jail." Clara felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The man who'd carved a wooden cross for her dying son, who'd taught children with infinite patience, who'd spoken Latin prayers with the reverence of a true believer, that man was sitting in a jail cell, accused of common theft. "Who made the accusation?" Clara asked, her mind already racing through possibilities and probabilities. "Mr. Hendricks himself," Rosa replied. "He says the money was in his safe yesterday morning and gone this afternoon. Says Mr. Pike was the only one who had opportunity, what with all the time he spends behind the store with those children." Clara's hands clenched into fists as the implications became clear. Someone had used Samuel's dedication to the children as evidence against him, twisting his generosity into proof of guilt. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. "Rosa," Clara said, her voice carrying the decisive tone that had served her well in crisis situations, "I need you to prepare the carriage. I'm going to town." She found Samuel in the cramped jail cell behind Sheriff Morrison's office, sitting on the narrow cot with the same quiet dignity he brought to every situation. His hands were folded in his lap, and he looked up when Clara entered with an expression that held no surprise at her presence. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said simply, "this is kind of you, but unnecessary." "Unnecessary?" Clara's voice rose despite her efforts at control. "You're accused of theft. Your reputation, your livelihood, your freedom, all of it, hanging in the balance based on accusations that anyone who knows you would recognize as absurd." Samuel's smile was sad, but genuine. "People believe what they need to believe, Mrs. Whitmore. Sometimes a man's circumstances make him a convenient target for other people's problems." "This isn't about convenience," Clara said firmly. "This is about justice, and I intend to see that you receive it." She spent the next 2 days conducting her own investigation, applying the systematic approach that had served her well in organizing church committees and social events. She interviewed Hendricks' employees, examined the timeline of the alleged theft, and paid careful attention to the details that didn't quite align with the official story. It was during her conversation with young Billy Cooper that Clara made the first significant discovery. The boy had come to her house in tears, convinced that somehow his presence at the teaching sessions had contributed to Samuel's troubles. "It's my fault," Billy sobbed. "If I hadn't been there so much, people wouldn't think Mr. Pike was suspicious." "Billy," Clara said gently, "you and the other children are the best part of Mr. Pike's day. Nothing about this situation is your fault." "But I saw something," Billy whispered, as if sharing a secret too dangerous for normal speech. "The day before, they say Mr. Pike stole the money. I was waiting for lessons to start, and I saw Mr. Hendricks talking to those men from the Cattle Buyers Association. They looked angry." Clara's attention sharpened. "What kind of angry?" "The kind my pa gets when someone owes him money," Billy replied. "And I heard one of them say something about making examples and sending messages." The conversation pointed Clara toward a line of inquiry that proved more fruitful than she'd dared hope. Within a day, she'd learned that Hendricks's general store was in serious financial trouble, owing money to several creditors who'd grown impatient with delayed payments. The missing $47 wasn't theft. It was part of a desperate attempt to manipulate circumstances and avoid facing the consequences of poor business decisions. But it was her discovery in Samuel's belongings that provided the most shocking revelation of all. Sheriff Morrison had allowed Clara to collect Samuel's personal effects from his boarding house room, partly out of respect for her social position and partly because no one else had volunteered for the task. She was packing his few possessions into a wooden crate when her fingers encountered something unexpected beneath his mattress, a small metal box carefully wrapped in oiled cloth. Inside the box, Clara found items that recontextualized everything she thought she knew about Samuel Pike. A military commission bearing the name Captain Samuel J. Pike, Twund, Missouri Infantry. A letter of commendation signed by General Ulysses S. Grant himself. A photograph of a younger Samuel in an officer's uniform, standing beside a group of soldiers whose bearing spoke of discipline and education. And most surprising of all, a medal, the Congressional Medal of Honor, awarded for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty during the Battle of Vicksburg. Clara sat on Samuel's narrow bed, holding these artifacts of a past he'd never mentioned, trying to reconcile the decorated war hero with the humble cowboy who'd taught children behind a general store. The man she'd met was clearly the same person who'd earned these honors, but he'd chosen to live as if none of it had ever happened. A letter at the bottom of the box provided some explanation. Written in Samuel's hand but never sent, it was addressed to his father and dated 3 years after the war's end. "Dear Father, I hope this finds you well and that your students continue to challenge your mind as mine once did. I write to tell you that I've decided not to return to academic life as we once discussed. The war showed me things about human nature that I'm not sure belong in lecture halls, and I find myself more at peace with simple work and quiet relationships than with the complexities of civilized society. Please don't think this choice reflects poorly on the education you provided or the values you instilled. Rather, it represents my attempt to live those values in circumstances where they might do some good without the complications that come with rank and recognition. I've learned that a man can teach as effectively from humble circumstances as from elevated ones, perhaps more so. Give my regards to the college, and know that your son continues to honor the principles you taught him, even if he applies them in ways you might not have expected. Clara understood now why Samuel had never defended himself using his military record, why he'd allowed people to underestimate him rather than claiming the respect his service had earned. He'd chosen authenticity over authority, preferring to be valued for his character rather than his achievements. The revelation cast the theft accusations in an even more sinister light. Someone was using Samuel's deliberate humility against him, counting on his reluctance to reveal his past as protection against investigation. They'd calculated that a decorated war hero wouldn't defend himself if it meant exposing the carefully constructed life he'd built in anonymity. They'd miscalculated the determination of a woman who'd learned to value substance over appearances. That evening, Clara Bell Whitmore requested a meeting with Sheriff Morrison, the town council, and anyone else who cared to attend. She arrived at the courthouse carrying Samuel's military records, the results of her investigation into Hendrix's financial troubles, and a detailed timeline that exposed the theft accusations as a desperate attempt to shift blame from poor business management to a convenient scapegoat. "Gentlemen," she announced to the assembled crowd, "I believe we owe Captain Samuel Pike an apology." The title hung in the air like a thunderclap, stopping conversations and redirecting attention with the force of unexpected revelation. Clara opened Samuel's military box and began laying out the evidence of his service, watching faces change as the community processed the magnitude of their misjudgment. "The man you've accused of petty theft," Clara continued, "is a decorated war hero who chose to live quietly among us, contributing to our children's education, and asking nothing in return except the opportunity to be useful. The real question isn't whether Captain Pike stole $47. It's why we were so eager to believe the worst about a man whose every action has demonstrated integrity and selflessness." Sheriff Morrison examined the military documents with growing embarrassment, while the assembled townspeople murmured among themselves, with the uncomfortable awareness that they'd been spectacularly wrong about someone they'd thought they understood. "Mrs. Whitmore," Morrison said finally, "if these documents are authentic—" "They're authentic," Clara interrupted, "as is the man sitting in your jail cell, a man who earned the Congressional Medal of Honor for risking his life to save his fellow soldiers, who held the rank of captain at age 26, and who chose to work as a cowboy rather than trade on his military reputation for social advantage." The revelation transformed not only Samuel's circumstances, but the entire community's understanding of judgment, assumption, and the difference between what people appeared to be and who they actually were. As Sheriff Morrison prepared to release Samuel and investigate the real source of Hendrix's missing money, Clara Bell Whitmore realized that she'd learned something profound about the nature of true nobility. It had nothing to do with social position and everything to do with choosing to serve others, regardless of recognition, reward. Samuel Pike had been teaching her that lesson from the moment they'd met, even when she'd been too blind to see it. Samuel Pike walked out of the Abilene jail a free man, but the weight of exposure settled on his shoulders like a heavy coat he'd never wanted to wear. Word of his military service had spread through town faster than prairie fire, transforming him overnight from a humble cowboy into a figure of local legend. People who'd barely acknowledged his existence now tipped their hats with exaggerated respect, while others stared at him with the uncomfortable fascination reserved for curiosities and contradictions. Clara waited for him outside the courthouse, her face reflecting the complex mixture of triumph and uncertainty that had characterized her emotions since discovering his hidden past. She'd succeeded in proving his innocence and exposing the real circumstances behind the theft accusations, but she could see in Samuel's expression that vindication had come at a cost he hadn't wanted to pay. "Captain Pike," she said quietly, testing how the title felt in her mouth. Samuel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Just, Samuel, please. The war ended a long time ago. They walked together through Abilene's dusty streets, both acutely aware of the attention their presence generated. Clara could feel eyes tracking their movement from storefront windows and doorways, the weight of speculation and gossip following them like shadows. "I'm sorry," Clara said as they reached the relative privacy of her front porch. "I know you didn't want your past revealed, but I couldn't let you suffer for crimes you didn't commit." Samuel leaned against the porch railing, his gaze directed toward the horizon where the prairie met the endless Kansas sky. "You did what you thought was right," he said simply. "I can't fault you for that, but you wish I'd found another way." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his fingers unconsciously tracing patterns on the wooden railing. "I've spent 8 years building a life where people judged me by my actions rather than my history, where children felt comfortable learning from me because I was just Mr. Pike, the cowboy who knew how to read. Now," he gestured toward the street where 2 women had stopped their conversation to stare at them. "Now I'm Captain Pike, the war hero, and everything's different." Clara felt a pang of regret at the unintended consequences of her efforts to help him. "Does it have to be different? You're still the same man who carved a cross for my son, who teaches children with infinite patience." "People see what they expect to see," Samuel replied. "Before, they saw a simple working man. Now they see a decorated officer who's chosen to live beneath his station. Both perspectives miss the truth, but at least the first one, let me do my work, without constant explanation." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a rider, a young man whose urgency was evident in his dust-covered clothes and lathered horse. He dismounted in front of Clara's house and approached with the focused determination of someone carrying important news. "Mrs. Whitmore," he called out, "I've got a telegram for you, from Kansas City." Clara accepted the yellow envelope with trembling fingers, her mind immediately jumping to worst-case scenarios. Telegrams rarely brought good news, especially ones that required immediate delivery. She opened the message and read it twice before the words fully registered. "Searching for Thomas. Whitmore, Abilene. Kansas. Stop. Have information regarding final weeks. Stop arriving Saturday train. Stop urgent family matter. Stop signed Colonel James Bradley, retired." Clara's legs suddenly felt unsteady, and she reached for the porch railing to support herself. Samuel was beside her instantly, his hand steady on her elbow. "What is it?" he asked, his voice carrying immediate concern. Clara handed him the telegram with nerveless fingers. "Someone's coming about Thomas, someone who knew him during his final weeks." Samuel read the message, his expression growing thoughtful. "Colonel Bradley," he said slowly. "That name Thomas mentioned him several times. He was the commanding officer at the fort, where Thomas spent his last months." "Fort?" Clara repeated, confusion evident in her voice. "What fort?" "Thomas was traveling, working on ranches." Samuel's face went through a series of expressions, surprise, understanding, and finally a deep sadness that suggested painful revelations ahead. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said carefully, "I think there are things about Thomas's final journey that you don't know, things he asked me not to share unless circumstances required it." Clara felt her world beginning to shift again, just when she'd thought she was finally understanding the full truth about her son's last months. "What kind of things?" Samuel guided her to one of the wicker chairs on the porch, his movements gentle but decisive. "Perhaps we should wait for Colonel Bradley to arrive. There are parts of Thomas's story that aren't mine to tell." But Clara's need to know had been building for 8 years, and the proximity of answers made waiting impossible. "Mr. Pike, Samuel, please. I've lived with questions and half-truths for too long. Whatever you know about my son's final weeks, I need to hear it." Samuel studied her face, weighing what he saw there against promises he'd made to a dying young man. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision. "Thomas wasn't just traveling when he became ill," Samuel said quietly. "He'd enlisted. He was serving as a civilian contractor at Fort Hays, working with the quartermaster's office to improve supply distribution to remote outposts. Clara felt as if the porch had dropped away beneath her feet. Enlisted? But he never. Why didn't he tell me? Because he knew you'd worry, Samuel replied. The work wasn't particularly dangerous, but it involved traveling to areas where there was some conflict with hostile tribes. Thomas wanted to contribute something meaningful, but he didn't want you spending months fearing for his safety. The revelation recontextualized everything Clara thought she'd understood about her son's final journey. He hadn't been wandering aimlessly or avoiding responsibility. He'd been serving his country in his own way, using his intelligence and education to improve conditions for soldiers and settlers. Is that how you met him? Clara asked. Were you at the fort too? Samuel nodded slowly. I was working as a civilian scout, using my military experience to help with logistics and security assessments. Thomas and I were assigned to the same supply convoy when he took ill. By the time we reached the next settlement, his fever was so high we thought, Samuel's voice caught slightly, we thought we might lose him. Clara closed her eyes, imagining her son burning with fever in some remote military outpost, surrounded by strangers who'd become his caregivers. But you stayed with him. Someone had to, Samuel said simply, and he reminded me of younger soldiers I'd known during the war, boys who needed someone to sit with them when death was close. The weight of what Samuel had done for Thomas and what he'd been carrying alone for 8 years settled over Clara like a revelation. This man had not only cared for her dying son, but had kept Thomas's secrets even when revealing them might have helped his own circumstances. Saturday, Clara said, referring to Colonel Bradley's impending arrival. What do you think he wants to tell me? Samuel's expression suggested he had suspicions, but was reluctant to voice them. I think, he said carefully, that Thomas may have left behind more than just memories. Colonel Bradley mentioned urgent family matters. The possibility that had been forming in Clara's mind crystallized into certainty. You think Thomas left something for me, something Colonel Bradley has been keeping? It's possible, Samuel confirmed. Thomas talked often about wanting to leave you something that would help you understand his choices, something that would explain why he'd chosen the path he did. Clara stood and walked to the edge of the porch, her mind racing through implications and possibilities. If Thomas had indeed left some final message or explanation, it would represent the closure she'd been seeking for 8 years. But it would also mean facing whatever truths her son had been trying to protect her from. Samuel, she said, turning back to him, whatever Colonel Bradley brings, whatever Thomas left behind, I want you to be there when I receive it. You knew my son during his final weeks better than anyone. You understand who he became and why he made the choices he did. Samuel hesitated, clearly aware of the social complications that would arise from his presence during such a private family moment. Mrs. Whitmore, that's very kind, but it's not kindness, Clara interrupted. It's necessity. Thomas chose to trust you with his final weeks. His final words, his final thoughts. If he left something behind, you're the only person who can help me understand what it means. Samuel Pike looked at Clara Bell Whitmore and saw something that hadn't been there when they'd first met. A woman who'd learned to value truth over comfort, substance over appearance, and genuine relationships over social convention. Her transformation from the sharp-tongued widow who'd tried to humiliate him into someone who sought his guidance during the most important moments of her life represented a journey that would have made Thomas proud. All right, he said quietly, if you're certain that's what you want. As they sat together on Clara's porch, watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across Abilene's dusty streets, both of them felt the weight of Saturday's approaching revelations. Whatever Colonel Bradley brought with him would complete the story that had begun with a Latin prayer in Murphy's saloon and continued through discoveries that had changed both their lives in ways they were still learning to understand. The truth about Thomas's final legacy was finally coming home, carried by a stranger who'd traveled hundreds of miles to deliver it to the mother who'd been waiting 8 years to receive it. Colonel James Bradley stepped off the Saturday afternoon train, carrying himself with the bearing of a career military man who'd learned to deliver difficult news with compassion. He was older than Clara had expected, perhaps 60, with silver hair and eyes that held the particular gravity that came from years of writing letters to mothers about sons who wouldn't be coming home. Clara and Samuel waited on the platform, both dressed in their finest clothes, as if formal attire could somehow prepare them for whatever revelations the colonel carried in his leather satchel. Clara had chosen her emerald silk dress, the same one she'd worn to Murphy's saloon weeks earlier, while Samuel wore the only suit he possessed, a simple black wool outfit that had served him for weddings, funerals, and rare occasions requiring civilian formality. "Mrs. Whitmore," Colonel Bradley said, approaching with measured steps. "I'm James Bradley. Thank you for agreeing to see me." Clara nodded, her throat suddenly too tight for easy speech. "Colonel, this is Samuel Pike. He was with Thomas during his final weeks." The colonel's eyes shifted to Samuel with immediate recognition and something approaching relief. "Captain Pike," he said, extending his hand. "Thomas spoke of you often. I'm glad you're here." The three of them made their way to Clara's house in relative silence, each aware that the conversation ahead would likely change everything they thought they understood about Thomas's legacy. Mrs. Rodriguez had prepared tea and small cakes, then disappeared with the tact of someone who understood the gravity of private family business. Colonel Bradley settled into the parlor's most comfortable chair and opened his leather satchel with deliberate care. "Mrs. Whitmore," he began, "your son was an exceptional young man. His work at Fort Hayes was invaluable, and his dedication to improving conditions for our soldiers earned him the respect of everyone who knew him." Clara nodded, still struggling to reconcile the image of Thomas as a military contractor with her memories of him as a young man more interested in literature than logistics. "When Thomas became ill," the colonel continued, "he was concerned about several unfinished matters. Most importantly, he wanted to ensure that certain documents reached you, along with explanations that would help you understand his choices." Bradley reached into his satchel and withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, but carefully preserved. Clara's name was written across the front in Thomas's unmistakable handwriting, along with instructions. "To be delivered only if I don't return home by Christmas, 1884. "He gave this to me 8 years ago," Bradley said quietly, "with instructions that it should only be opened in your presence, with Captain Pike serving as witness." Thomas believed that Captain Pike's account of his final weeks would help you understand the context of what he'd written. Clara accepted the envelope with trembling hands, feeling the weight of her son's final thoughts pressing against her palms like a living thing. Was there anything else?" Colonel Bradley smiled, the first genuinely warm expression he'd shown since arriving. There was indeed. He reached back into his satchel and withdrew a small wooden box, similar to the one that had held Samuel's military records, but newer, crafted with the careful attention to detail that characterized Thomas's approach to everything important. "Your son spent his final months working on this," Bradley explained. "It was his way of ensuring that his work and his understanding of what mattered most in life would continue, even if he couldn't." Clara opened the box to find a collection of carefully organized documents, detailed plans for establishing schools in remote communities, funding proposals for educational programs that would serve children regardless of their family's economic circumstances, and a comprehensive curriculum that combined practical skills with classical learning. At the center of it all was a letter addressed to the future founders of the Thomas Whitmore Educational Foundation. "He wanted you to have the resources and the plans to create something lasting," Colonel Bradley said. "Something that would honor the kind of education he'd learned, to value the kind that Captain Pike had shown him was possible." Samuel leaned forward, his eyes scanning the documents with growing amazement. "He was planning a school system," he said quietly, "based on the methods we'd discussed, but expanded to reach entire communities." "More than that," Bradley confirmed. He'd arranged for a portion of his military pay to be held in trust, with instructions that it should be combined with whatever resources you could provide to establish educational opportunities for children who might otherwise go without. Clara felt her vision blur as the magnitude of Thomas's final gift became clear. He hadn't just left her money or sentimental keepsakes, he'd left her a mission, a way to transform her grief into something that would benefit countless children for generations to come. "There's one more thing," Bradley said, reaching into the box to withdraw a final document. Thomas wrote specific instructions about who should oversee the educational aspects of his foundation. He named Captain Pike as the first director of curriculum and instruction, with full authority to implement the teaching methods they'd developed together. Samuel's face went pale with shock. "He couldn't have known I'd still be here when you arrived." "He hoped you would be," Bradley replied. "He believed that if his mother ever met you properly, she'd recognize the same qualities he'd admired. He was betting that you'd still be in Abilene, still teaching children, still being the kind of man he'd learned to respect above all others." Clara looked at Samuel with new understanding. Thomas hadn't just trusted Samuel with his final weeks, he'd trusted him with his mother's future, believing that the man who'd shown such kindness to a dying stranger would extend that same care to the mother left behind. The town charter that Clara had used to defend Samuel weeks earlier suddenly took on deeper significance. Thomas had understood that real change required both resources and legal authority, and he'd provided both through careful planning and absolute faith in the people he'd chosen to carry forward his vision. "Mrs. Whitmore," Colonel Bradley said gently, "your son wanted you to know that every choice he made during his final years was guided by love for you and hope for the future you might build together, even if he couldn't be there to see it." Clara's hands trembled as she broke the wax seal on Thomas's final letter. 8 years of questions and grief condensed into whatever words her son had chosen as his goodbye. The paper was thick and expensive. Thomas had clearly wanted this message to endure, and his handwriting was careful, deliberate, bearing none of the urgency that might have characterized a deathbed confession. "My dearest mother," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means I did not return home as promised, and Colonel Bradley has completed the mission I entrusted to him. Please know that every word I write comes from a heart full of love and gratitude for the woman who shaped my mind and taught me to value both learning and kindness." Clara paused, already overwhelmed by hearing Thomas's voice again, after so many years of silence. Samuel moved closer, not to read over her shoulder, but to offer the silent support of someone who understood the weight of final words. "I need you to know that my travels were not an escape from your expectations or a rejection of the education you provided. Rather, they were an attempt to apply that education in ways that would make you proud. I enlisted as a civilian contractor because I believed my knowledge could serve a purpose larger than my own advancement, and I have never regretted that choice." Clara felt tears threatening but forced herself to continue reading. "During my service, I met a man who changed my understanding of what true education means. Captain Samuel Pike possessed every qualification to succeed in the most elevated social circles, yet he chose to work quietly among people others had dismissed as unworthy of serious attention. Through him, I learned that the highest application of learning is teaching others to discover their own potential." Samuel shifted uncomfortably at being mentioned so prominently in Thomas's farewell letter, but Clara reached out and grasped his hand, anchoring herself to his presence as she navigated her son's final thoughts. "Mother, I know you will meet Captain Pike someday, and I hope you will see in him what I have learned to value above all else, the rare combination of genuine wisdom and authentic humility. He has shown me how to live with honor regardless of circumstances. And he has taught me that the measure of a man has nothing to do with the recognition he receives and everything to do with the good he does when no one is watching." Clara glanced at Samuel, seeing in his expression the deep emotion he'd been carrying since Thomas's death. Not just grief for a lost friend, but the weight of promises made to a dying young man. If I do not survive to implement the plans I have made, I want you to know that I have arranged for resources that could transform how education is provided to children who would otherwise go without. Captain Pike understands these plans and has agreed to oversee their implementation, but only if you choose to participate. I am not binding you to my vision, Mother. I am offering you an opportunity to build something that would honor both the education you gave me and the wisdom I learned from him. The letter continued with specific details about the trust fund Thomas had established, the legal arrangements he'd made for the foundation, and his hopes for how Clara and Samuel might work together to create educational opportunities that combined academic rigor with emotional support. I have one final request, Mother, and it may be the most important thing I ever ask of you. Do not let pride or social convention prevent you from recognizing the extraordinary man who will help deliver this letter. Captain Pike has earned my respect not through rank or title, but through character demonstrated daily in small acts of kindness and large gestures of sacrifice. If you can see past the surface to the substance beneath, you will find in him a partner worthy of the mission I am entrusting to you both. Clara's vision blurred completely now, and she had to pause before reading Thomas's closing words. I love you, Mother, more than I ever found adequate words to express. If my death brings you sorrow, let it also bring you purpose. Build something beautiful from the foundation I am leaving behind, and know that every child who benefits from your work will be a living memorial to the love that shaped us both. Your devoted son, Thomas. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Clara's quiet weeping and the distant noise of Abilene going about its Saturday evening business. Colonel Bradley sat respectfully still, while Samuel maintained his supportive presence without presuming to intrude on Clara's grief. Finally, Clara looked up at Samuel through her tears, and in that moment, something fundamental shifted between them. The barriers that had separated them, social position, assumptions about worth, the careful distance they'd maintained, even as their partnership deepened, suddenly felt not just unnecessary, but impossible to sustain. He knew, Clara said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Somehow he knew that if I met you properly, if I saw you as he did. Clara, Samuel said, and the use of her first name felt like the crossing of a threshold they hadn't even realized they'd been approaching. She stood and moved to the window, still clutching Thomas's letter. When she turned back to face Samuel and Colonel Bradley, her bearing had changed. The grief was still there, but it was accompanied by something else, resolve, purpose, and the kind of quiet determination that characterized people who'd found their calling. Mr. Pike, she said formally, then corrected herself. Samuel, will you help me build the school Thomas envisioned? Samuel Pike rose from his chair and moved to stand beside Clara Bell Whitmore, two people who'd been brought together by tragedy and transformed by the wisdom of a young man who'd understood that love could bridge any distance, overcome any obstacle, and create beauty from the most unlikely circumstances. It would be my honor, he said simply. Outside the window, the sun was setting over Abilene, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise new beginnings built on the foundation of old sorrows finally transformed into hope. 6 months later, Clara Bell Pike stood at the altar of Abilene's Methodist Church, wearing her grandmother's pearl-colored silk dress and a smile that had taken 57 years to fully develop. Samuel waited beside her in his best suit, the same black wool he'd worn to receive Thomas's letter, now pressed and brushed to respectability for the most important day of his life. The congregation that filled the church represented a transformation as remarkable as the one that had brought the bride and groom together. In the front pews sat the children from their teaching sessions, Jimmy Chen, in a new shirt his family had saved months to purchase, Maria Santos clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked that morning, Billy Cooper trying to contain his excitement at seeing his beloved teachers married. Behind them, the familiar faces of Abilene's social establishment mingled with cowboys, railroad workers, shopkeepers, and families who'd never before been invited to witness the town's more formal ceremonies. Reverend Matthews, who'd once questioned Clara's association with Samuel, now spoke the marriage vows with genuine warmth. Having learned through the establishment of the Whitmore Foundation that his initial judgments had been spectacularly wrong. The man he'd dismissed as unsuitable company for a respectable widow had proven to be not only a decorated war hero, but an educator whose innovative methods were already attracting attention from as far away as Kansas City. Do you, Clara Bell Whitmore, take Samuel Pike to be your lawfully wedded husband, to honor and cherish, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for as long as you both shall live? Clara's "I do" rang through the church with the conviction of someone who'd learned to value substance over surface, character over convention. When Samuel slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, replacing the ornate ring her first husband had chosen with something that reflected their shared commitment to authentic living, Clara felt the final walls around her heart dissolve completely. The reception that followed took place in the completed schoolhouse of the Thomas Whitmore Educational Foundation, a building that represented everything the young man had envisioned when he'd entrusted his legacy to the two people who now stood as husband and wife. The structure was larger than Abilene's original schoolhouse, but designed with the same practical elegance that characterized all of Clara and Samuel's collaborative efforts. Large windows filled the rooms with natural light, while built-in shelves held books in multiple languages, reflecting the diverse population the school was designed to serve. At the center of the main classroom stood a memorial that Clara and Samuel had created together, a simple stone tablet bearing an inscription they'd composed in both English and Latin. In memory of Thomas Whitmore, who taught us that true education builds bridges between hearts as well as minds. Benedic Domine nos et haec tua dona bless, O Lord, us and these thy gifts. The Latin words were the same ones Samuel had spoken in Murphy's saloon all those months ago, the blessing for a dying mother that had begun their unlikely journey toward understanding and love. Now, they served as a permanent reminder that the most profound connections often emerged from the most unexpected circumstances. Margaret Sullivan, who'd once warned Clara about the impropriety of her friendship with Samuel, now served as secretary of the Foundation's board of directors, having discovered that her organizational skills were perfectly suited to managing the complex logistics of operating a school that welcomed children, regardless of their family's ability to pay traditional tuition. "Clara," Margaret said, approaching the bride with genuine warmth, "I owe you an apology, and perhaps more importantly, I owe you thanks. This school, what you and Samuel have built, it's given my own children opportunities I never imagined possible." Clara smiled, remembering the sharp-tongued woman who'd once tried to convince her that social reputation mattered more than human connection. "Margaret, we've all learned things we didn't expect to learn. That's what education is supposed to do." As the afternoon progressed, Clara found herself standing beside the memorial stone, watching Samuel demonstrate basic Latin pronunciation to a group of fascinated children. His patient teaching methods had lost none of their effectiveness since their marriage. If anything, the security of their partnership had freed him to take even greater risks in developing innovative approaches to learning. "Mrs. Pike," a voice said behind her, and Clara turned to find Jimmy Chen, now 14 and serving as a teaching assistant in the Foundation's expanded programs. "Would you like to see the surprise we prepared?" Clara followed Jimmy to a corner of the classroom where the other children had gathered around a large object covered with a paint-splattered cloth. When they pulled away the covering, Clara gasped to see a hand-carved wooden lectern designed in the same style as Samuel's teaching slate, but large enough to hold the substantial books that formed the Foundation's curriculum. "We all worked on it," Maria Santos explained, her English now fluent and confident. "Mr. Pike taught us the woodworking, and Mrs. Patterson helped with the finishing. But the design that was Billy's idea." Billy Cooper, now 16, and preparing to attend Teachers College with a scholarship from the Foundation, stepped forward with the shy pride of someone who'd learned to trust his own creativity. I remembered how Mr. Pike always kept his slate so clean and ready for the next lesson. I thought you should have something just as special for your books. Clara ran her fingers over the smooth wood, recognizing in the careful craftsmanship the same patience and attention to detail that Samuel brought to all his teaching. But more than that, she saw in this gift the culmination of everything Thomas had hoped to achieve. Children from different backgrounds, working together to create something beautiful, guided by principles of mutual respect and shared purpose. Samuel appeared beside her, drawn by the sounds of celebration. When he saw the lectern, his expression reflected the same mixture of surprise and deep emotion that Clara felt. "It's beautiful," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of recognition that this gift represented far more than skilled woodworking. "It's what Thomas would have wanted," Clara replied, thinking of her son's belief that education should create bonds between people rather than barriers. As the sun set over Abilene, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that seemed to bless the day's celebrations, Clara and Samuel Pike stood together in their school, surrounded by the children whose lives they'd touched and who had, in turn, transformed their understanding of what mattered most in life. The wooden lectern would hold thousands of books in the years to come, supporting lessons in literature, mathematics, science, and languages that would prepare Abilene's children for futures their parents had never imagined possible. But it would also stand as a reminder that the most important education happened not through the transfer of information, but through the patient cultivation of human dignity and the radical belief that every person, regardless of circumstances, possessed worth that deserved recognition and nurture. In Murphy's saloon that evening, the old-timers would tell stories about the day the wealthy widow married the humble cowboy, creating legends that would grow with each retelling. But Clara and Samuel Pike knew the real story was simpler and more profound. Sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as challenges, the deepest wisdom emerges from unexpected teachers, and love has the power to transform not just individuals but entire communities. When people have the courage to see beyond surface appearances to the truth that lies beneath.